that we need to reinvent ourselves, that we need to redesign our democratic institutions. That
most indigenous peoples never did have or haven't fully consented to the social orders and or governmental authority of the states that have been thrust upon them.
This is the Go Maluku podcast.
What are the key areas that should be considered for building and redesigning a new social contract that serves the well-being of indigenous peoples and other excluded social groups in society? Big question, obviously. If I may preclude it with an easier question, what is a social contract? Because that's what people would like to know. What is a social contract? Maria or James, please, whoever feels would like to start.
Please, James, go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. Well, it's interesting we're talking about using the term social contract, and I think it can be useful. The term social contract arose as part of the body of political theory in the 17th century Enlightenment era. We can talk about philosophers such as Rousseau and Hobbes, who at the time gave currency to that term and the idea behind it. In that context, it referred to the implicit or tacit consent that individuals grant to be governed as part of a society and to have their absolute freedom limited. And that consent is given in exchange for protection of certain retained rights and social order. This theory was juxtaposed against the long-standing ideas of, monarchical government by divine right, which had been the dominating theory of government for centuries, of course. So today we can see the term social contract used more generally to refer to the explicit or implicit agreements members of a society or community make to establish the moral and political rules of behavior. And as we've heard in his recent speech and in his recent statement that was read to us, the Secretary General referred to the need for a new social contract within society and at the global level to overcome the many problems facing individuals, peoples in the world today, including problems of inequality and marginalization of indigenous peoples. So if we take the idea of a social context in our present context, it should be understood, I think, that most indigenous peoples never did have or haven't fully consented to the social orders and or governmental authority of the states that have been thrust upon them. In fact, as we know, that is the problem at the root of the historical and ongoing oppression and marginalization faced by indigenous peoples. So for indigenous peoples, I think establishing a new social contract would be a remedy to the lack of initial consent to be governed by the states that have grown up around them, and would entail the construction of a new social order based on consensus and respect for those rights. And as stated in the Secretary General's statement, that new social contract, in this sense, should be based at a minimum on the terms established by the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international instruments.
Thank you, James. Maria?
Well, I think that I cannot agree more with James with the idea of having the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples as a basis for a new social contract. I think that that's the point of reference, but also the Sustainable Development Goals. And I understand when we hear over and over again that it is time for a new social contract. And why? Because after times of crisis, I think that there is a wake up in society saying we cannot continue in the way we are living. And basically, when we look at what is happening in the world, we see, these multiple crises converging. We see, the climate crisis the biodiversity extinction crisis, the inequalities crisis, the poverty crisis, the violence crisis, all coming together to tell us that we cannot put band-aids here and there, and we cannot just have fragmented responses. Is either you provide, health, or you work on education, or you understand how to build a plurinational state like my own and several others in my part of the world. But you need to understand, society as a whole from a holistic perspective. And a holistic perspective, I think that Indigenous peoples are the experts to understand interconnections, interconnectedness, the sense of community, the sense of collective purpose. And I think that's what the social contract is about. It is about dialogue. It is about intercultural, intergenerational dialogue to build something new. And I think that the COVID pandemic has been a magnifier of already existing inequalities, neocolonial practices and societal designs. We see, for example, in my region, in Latin America and the Caribbean, look at what has happened with the COVID-19 crisis. 620,000 members of Indigenous peoples, communities in the Americas infected with the COVID-19, and more than 15,000 Indigenous persons have died because of COVID. And this is an indicator. And what it indicates is, yet again, in spite of formal decolonization, practices of exclusion, of domination, of racism, of lack of access to the fundamental human rights, such as the right to health, for example, the right to quality education that is culturally sensitive. These are very, very basic rights. And here we are watching the world and watching sometimes our multilateral responses being insufficient, and being insufficient because of greed, because of lack of generosity, because of lack of cooperation. And what you see in the world and in the multilateral responses that we are putting together to respond to this crisis, I think provides us an opportunity to really acknowledge that our world is dysfunctional, that we need to reinvent ourselves, that we need to redesign our democratic institutions, that we need to think about what the rule of law means, what Indigenous peoples' participation means, what prior informed consent, this very important principle and right, means in the crafting of this new social contract. And to make the story short, a new social contract has to be intergenerational, intercultural, fully inclusive, all-encompassing, holistic. You cannot try to fix the economy if you don't fix the souls and minds of humans worldwide. If humanity does not reconcile with nature. So it is a whole. We have an opportunity to rethink the relationship between human society, the economy, politics, and nature. And I think that in my humble opinion, that's what the social contract talks about. It is a modern version of what Hobbes or Rousseau thought about, because we are living a very different world. And of course, I think we have to acknowledge where Indigenous peoples worldwide stand in terms of inequality, in terms of inclusion, in terms of rights deficit. But at the same time, I think we have to really understand and benefit from the incredible wisdom of Indigenous peoples from around the world. My opinion after all these years is Indigenous peoples, of course, should be the architects of their own destinies. But more importantly, I think that so-called Western societies should benefit, learn, and be fed by the agency and the knowledge and the expertise and the experience of Indigenous peoples worldwide. So Indigenous peoples should not be only speaking about Indigenous peoples' issues and rights, but really speak to the whole of society. And this, of course, it's not only the task of governments. We tend to do, and I have done that myself in the past, to say, here's the package and bring it to the government so they just fix it and do it for us. I think it's a whole of society and understanding, of course, and when we speak about society, we do not speak about a monolithic a collection of people. We speak about our diversity of cultures, of vision, of epistemologies, of understanding development. And that's what the wealth of humanities precisely resides in its diversity. And I know, and when we were exchanging, Ghazali, you were saying, some Indigenous persons do not understand what the social contract is about. And perhaps it is not only a question that Indigenous peoples around the world ask themselves, but we all ask ourselves, because there is a time also for creativity, for reshaping, for retooling our political systems and our social coexistence. Back to you, Ghazali.
My friends, I hope you enjoyed this. Please consider to subscribe, to comment, and to share this video on your socials.